The morning of my wedding was supposed to be perfect, and in many ways it was, because after months of planning, fighting with caterers, wrangling relatives, and making sure every detail lined up just right, my backyard had been transformed into something magical. Rows of white chairs lined the freshly cut grass. Fairy lights twinkled overhead, and a small arch decorated with roses stood tall at the edge of the lawn, waiting for me and the woman of my dreams to exchange vows beneath it. My fiancée Jenna was inside with her bridesmaids getting ready. My family had flown in from all over the country, and friends were already trickling in, smiles on their faces and joy in their voices. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, a day where the only tears were happy ones. But of course that was before Karen entered the picture. Now, I knew from the moment Jenna and I bought this house that the neighborhood HOA was full of busybodies, the kind of people who love to measure grass with rulers and write nasty notes about trash cans being left out too long, but I didn't think they'd sink to this level. Karen was the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, not technically the president, mind you, but the loudest, most obnoxious, and most aggressive member, which in a way made her even worse, because she carried herself like she owned the neighborhood and everyone in it. She had complained when I built my deck, even though it was approved. She complained when Jenna planted a row of hydrangeas along the fence, saying they were too blue for the community aesthetic. She even complained once when my nephew rode his bike past her driveway as if the entire street belonged to her. But none of that compared to what she tried to pull on my wedding day. It started subtly enough with her walking past the setup. In the morning, arms crossed, lips pursed, and eyes darting around like she was taking mental notes of every violation she could later cite. I ignored her, focusing instead on greeting my relatives, but sure enough, an hour before the ceremony, just as the string quartet was warming up, Karen stormed into my yard like she owned the place. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, pointing at the chairs and the arch. "This is against HOA policy. You need a permit to host an event like this, and we never approved it." My best man, Mike, tried to step in, telling her it was my property and she had no say over what I did in my own backyard, but Karen wasn't having it. She started threatening fines, threatening to shut this whole thing down, and finally, with a smug smile, pulled out her phone. I watched as she dialed 911 and loudly declared that there was an illegal event happening in her neighborhood and that she needed police dispatched immediately. I'll admit, part of me wanted to laugh right then and there, the sheer audacity of it all. The arrogance, the entitlement, but another part of me simmered with anger. Because here was this woman, trying to ruin one of the most important days of my life, not because it affected her in any way, but simply because she couldn't stand the idea of not being in control. The guests looked uneasy, whispering among themselves, some even glancing at me as if wondering what would happen when the cops arrived. Little did they know, I wasn't just any homeowner dealing with an overbearing HOA. I was the chief of police for the city, and I was already very familiar with how frivolous calls like this played out. Karen thought she was summoning a cavalry to her side, but what she was really doing was digging herself a hole deeper than she could possibly imagine. I let her rant and rave, allowed her the satisfaction of thinking she'd scored some kind of victory, because the truth was I already had a plan forming in my head. She had made the call, the wheels were in motion, but when that squad car rolled up to my house in a few minutes, it wasn't going to be me who looked foolish. No, it was going to be Karen, exposed in front of the very community she lorded over, and in front of my entire family and all my friends on the day of my wedding, no less. If she wanted a showdown, she was going to get one, but she had no idea just who she was picking a fight with. The sound of sirens faintly echoed down the street, and Karen's smug grin widened as she stood proudly in the middle of my backyard, like some self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's purity, arms folded and chin raised as if she'd just summoned divine justice itself, while my guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering nervously, some even asking me in hushed tones if the wedding would be shut down, and Jenna's bridesmaids peeked out the window inside, worried. The day would be ruined before it even began. Karen paced theatrically, clearly rehearsing in her head the lines she would deliver to the arriving officers, already imagining herself as the heroine of the story, the vigilant neighbor who had bravely stood up to the lawlessness of a man simply trying to marry the woman he loved. But what she didn't know was that those sirens were bringing not her salvation, but her public downfall. The first squad car pulled up to the curb, lights flashing, and two uniformed officers stepped out, adjusting their belts as they looked toward the commotion in my yard. Karen bolted to the gate before they could even approach, launching into a shrill tirade about how this man, she jabbed her finger in my direction like she was pointing out a fugitive, was holding an illegal gathering and breaking community laws, and how she, as a concerned member of the HOA, demanded that the police shut it down immediately, issue fines, and escort me off my own property. The officers exchanged a quick look, clearly skeptical but too professional to show it outright, and one of them began scribbling notes while the other finally addressed me. "Sir, do you live here?" he asked, his tone calm but carrying the weight of procedure. Before I could answer, Karen shrieked again. "Of course he doesn't. He's just renting without authorization, and this whole thing is unlicensed, and it's a danger to the neighborhood." She was digging herself deeper with every word, unaware of the trap she was walking into, and I finally decided it was time to end the performance. I stepped forward slowly, straightening my tie, and said in a firm but measured voice, "Yes, officer. This is my property deed and title in my name, and I'm hosting my wedding here today." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes like I was lying, but the officers listened attentively. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my wallet, flipping it open to reveal not just my driver's license but my badge, the unmistakable gold and silver emblem of the city's police chief. The officers' eyes widened slightly, their posture shifting instantly from procedural formality to professional respect, and Karen's smugness froze mid-expression, her mouth still open as if she'd been struck dumb by what she saw. The senior officer cleared his throat, glanced at me, then at Karen, and said, "Ma'am, this is Chief Daniels." You could have heard a pin drop in the backyard at that moment, as every guest leaned forward, some gasping, others smirking, as they realized the gravity of the situation. Karen blinked rapidly, stammering, "Chief? What? No, that can't be right. He's just, but she had nothing to stand on anymore." The senior officer continued, "You called in a false report, ma'am. There is no illegal activity here, and wasting emergency resources on personal disputes is a serious offense." Karen's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds, and she started backpedaling furiously, waving her hands and saying, No, it was a misunderstanding. I was just concerned about the neighborhood's safety, that's all." But the officers weren't buying it, and neither was I. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so that only she and the officers could hear, though loud enough for the nearest rows of guests to catch my words. "You tried to ruin my wedding. On my own property, with a 911 call you knew was baseless. Do you have any idea how much trouble you've just brought on yourself?" Karen sputtered, shaking her head, muttering excuses about HOA regulations, about community ordinances that had no legal basis, and about how she was just trying to uphold standards, but I cut her off with a raised hand. "Karen, there are community guidelines, sure, but they don't override property law, and they sure as hell don't justify tying up police resources. You wasted officers' time on a day when they could have been responding to real emergencies. That's not just petty, it's criminal." The officers nodded in agreement, and one of them said, "Ma'am, you could be facing a fine for misuse of emergency services." Karen gasped as if the world itself had betrayed her, clutching her pearls dramatically and whispering, "But I was only trying to help," her voice trembling as though she were the victim. My guests, however, weren't sympathetic. They started murmuring, some chuckling quietly, others outright shaking their heads at her audacity. Mike, my best man, muttered just loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Guess the queen just lost her crown," and laughter rippled through the audience, making Karen flush even deeper crimson. I gave the officers a polite nod, signaling that I would handle things from here, and they excused themselves after warning Karen to stop wasting resources and advising her to leave the property immediately. But Karen, stubborn as ever, refused to budge, planting her feet like a child in the middle of a tantrum. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of humiliation. "I'll have the entire HOA board down here. We'll sue. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Jenna step outside. Radiant in her gown, calm but clearly irritated that her big moment was being delayed. Jenna fixed Karen with a glare sharp enough to cut glass and said, "Karen, this is my wedding day. Either you leave quietly, or I'll personally call the HOA president and remind him that the chief of police happens to be my husband-to-be. How do you think that will play at your next board meeting?" The crowd cheered lightly, applauding Jenna's composure, and for the first time, Karen looked truly cornered. She stammered again, muttered something about just trying to enforce the rules, then finally turned and stormed off, heels clacking angrily on the pavement as she disappeared down the street, her shoulders hunched in defeat. I watched her go, not with satisfaction, but with the knowledge that she wasn't done. Karen never admitted defeat so easily, and I knew she'd be back in some form, whether with a bogus complaint, a legal threat, or some other harebrained scheme to regain her sense of power. But for now, she was gone, and the wedding could proceed. The officers wished me congratulations, the guests cheered, and Jenna smiled at me with a look that said nothing, not even Karen, could ruin what we had. Still, in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a much bigger confrontation between me, and Karen herself, and as much as I wanted to ignore it, I also knew one thing for certain. If she thought she could use rules, fines, or fear to control me, she had picked the wrong man to mess with. The wedding finally moved forward after Karen's stormy exit, laughter and applause breaking the tension as Jenna and I exchanged vows under the archway of flowers my sister had arranged that morning. But while the moment was beautiful, part of me couldn't fully relax because I knew Karen wasn't the kind of person to lick her wounds quietly. She was regrouping, planning, and calculating how to reclaim her lost dignity. And as much as I wanted to forget about her and focus on my new wife, I also had enough years of experience as a cop and as chief now to know when someone was plotting a comeback. For a week after the ceremony, things were calm, but then the letters started coming, formal envelopes from the HOA addressed to me, stamped with urgency, citing obscure regulations about noise disturbances, parking infractions, and even unauthorized structures on my land, none of which held any actual legal weight, but each delivered with the smug authority of people who believed their bylaws outweighed city ordinances. I sat at my kitchen table one evening, flipping through the growing stack, Jenna leaning over my shoulder with a frown, muttering, "She's behind this, it's too much of a coincidence." And she was right. The language of the letters practically screamed Karen. Her favorite phrases like community harmony and failure to uphold neighborhood standards sprinkled throughout like fingerprints. At first, I ignored them, knowing the HOA had no jurisdiction over my private property. But when a notice came threatening daily fines of $1,000 unless I ceased hosting unapproved gatherings, I realized Karen was escalating faster than I anticipated. The following weekend, I decided to confront the board directly. I walked into the HOA's monthly meeting, held in their sterile little clubhouse with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and a podium at the front where the board members sat like a jury, Karen front and center, smiling triumphantly as if she'd already won. The room was filled with residents, some bored, some curious, and a few clearly there just for gossip. As soon as I entered, whispers rippled through the crowd. "That's the guy from the wedding. He's the police chief, right? What's he doing here?" Karen seized the moment, standing tall and announcing, "Chief Daniels. Thank you for joining us, though I must remind everyone that here we are all equal under the HOA bylaws." The smugness in her tone was enough to make my teeth clench, but I forced a smile and replied evenly, "Karen, board members, I'm here because I've received a number of letters, fines, warnings, threats regarding my property. I'd like to address them directly." Karen's eyes gleamed as she leaned into the microphone, clearly relishing the stage. Yes, well, your event last week was disruptive to the neighborhood, and as per Section 14, subsection B, any large gatherings must be approved by the board to ensure peace and order. Her voice carried as if she were declaring law, but I cut in before she could gain momentum. With all due respect, Karen and board members, the HOA has no authority over private property beyond the scope defined in the actual covenants, and my property is exempt from those covenants. I own my land outright. Your bylaws don't apply? To me, gasps spread through the room and Karen quickly waved her hands. Oh, please, that's nonsense. Everyone here must adhere to the same standards, otherwise what kind of community would this be? A circus? Her supporters, about half a dozen residents who always seemed to orbit around her, nodded in muttered agreement, but others shifted uneasily, unsure of where the truth lay. I pulled a folder from under my arm, laying it on the table with deliberate weight. Here is the deed to my property, signed and filed with the county. Here are the exemption documents that explicitly state I am not under HOA jurisdiction. And here I slid out the HOA's own covenant agreement, which I had obtained from the county clerk's office, is the section that lists properties under your governance. Mine is not included. You've been sending me baseless threats. Karen's face twitched, but she quickly recovered, plastering on her fake smile. Well, Chief, perhaps that's a clerical error, but surely you can understand we must hold everyone accountable to preserve harmony. After all, if we let one person ignore the rules, chaos follows. Her voice had that shrill, performative tone of a politician trying to rally a crowd, and some residents clapped politely, though others looked skeptical. I leaned forward, lowering my voice, but letting it carry just enough to command attention. Karen, let's be clear. You called 911 to shut down my wedding, wasting police resources. You've now attempted to levy unauthorized fines. That's harassment. And if you continue, you won't just be facing angry neighbors, you'll be facing legal consequences. The room buzzed with murmurs, residents exchanging wide-eyed looks, while Karen sputtered, "Legal consequences? For doing my duty as board president?" I straightened and said firmly, "For abusing your position. And I assure you I won't hesitate to act if this continues." One of the other board members, a balding man with glasses named Tom, cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should table this discussion until we consult legal counsel," he suggested, clearly wanting to diffuse the escalating tension. Karen shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel, but forced herself to nod. "Very well. Meeting adjourned." She banged the gavel with unnecessary force, signaling both her anger and her need to reassert control. As people filed out, I overheard whispers, some mocking Karen, others questioning whether the HOA really had the authority she always claimed. A few even approached me quietly, thanking me for standing up to her, admitting they'd been bullied by her tactics but had been too afraid to resist. Driving home that night, Jenna squeezed my hand and said softly, "You rattled her, but she's not going to let this go." I knew she was right. And sure enough, the next morning, I awoke to find not just another letter in the mailbox, but an actual notice taped to my front gate. Cease and desist or face HOA litigation. It was signed by Karen herself. I stared at it for a long moment, then chuckled, shaking my head at the audacity. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to find out I'd fought bigger battles than a suburban power trip. And unlike her, I knew the law inside and out, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The notice taped to my front gate was the spark that lit the fire, because Karen had crossed the final line from harassment into open intimidation, and while I could have ripped the paper down, laughed, and ignored it as another empty bluff, I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the precedent she was setting, the way she used her position to bully neighbors, threaten families, and create a climate of fear in what should have been a peaceful community. And as police chief, I had a responsibility not just to defend my own rights, but to expose the corruption festering under the HOA's polished veneer. Instead of reacting in anger, I decided to let Karen make her next move. Sure enough, a week later, I was served with what she grandly titled a summons to HOA arbitration, a flimsy packet of papers stuffed into an envelope that looked official on the surface but crumbled under scrutiny. filled with citations of bylaws that didn't apply to me, handwritten notes in the margins about habitual disruption, and an absurd claim that my wedding had lowered property values by creating an unsafe precedent for gatherings. Jenna rolled her eyes when she read it, muttering, "She really thinks she's judge, jury, and executioner," and I nodded, replying, "Let her think it, because the higher she climbs on this ladder of delusion, the harder she fall when the truth comes crashing down." I called our city attorney, Mark, a man I'd worked with on several high-profile cases, and when I explained the situation, he laughed so hard I thought he might drop the phone. Wait, let me get this straight," he chuckled between breaths. "The HOA is threatening litigation against the police chief for holding a wedding on property that isn't even under their jurisdiction." His laughter faded into a more serious tone. "Daniels, this isn't arbitration. This is harassment, plain and simple. If you want, I'll file a countersuit tomorrow." But I told him to hold off, at least for now, because I wanted Karen to march herself into the trap she was setting. A few days later, I attended the so-called arbitration, which was held in the HOA clubhouse, the same sterile room where Karen loved to play queen bee. She had gathered the board, a handful of residents, and even brought in a man she introduced with great pomp as the HOA's legal advisor, though when I quietly asked him where he was licensed, he admitted sheepishly that he wasn't an attorney at all, but a paralegal friend of hers who helped with paperwork sometimes. The arrogance was staggering, but I kept my composure, sitting at the table across from her with my own thick folder of evidence. Karen opened the meeting with a smug grin, declaring, "We are gathered today to resolve the repeated violations of community standards perpetrated by Chief Daniels, who has shown a blatant disregard for our rules and the harmony of this neighborhood." She rattled on for 10 minutes, waving around photographs of my wedding neighbors in suits. Cars parked neatly along the road, kids playing in the backyard trying to spin them into evidence of chaos. Finally, she turned to me and sneered, "Do you deny that this event caused disturbance and lowered the quality of life for your neighbors?" I leaned back in my chair, folded my arms, and replied calmly, "What I deny, Karen, is your authority over my property. What I deny is the legitimacy of this proceeding. And what I deny is your right to harass me or anyone else in this neighborhood with threats and lies." Gasps rippled through the room, and Karen's face flushed crimson. She slammed her gavel on the table, shouting, "You will respect the authority of this board." But before I could even respond, Tom, the balding board member who had looked nervous weeks earlier, spoke up. "Karen, maybe we should consider that Daniels has a point. His property isn't listed under our jurisdiction. We could be opening ourselves to liability if we keep pressing this." Karen whipped her head toward him, eyes blazing, and hissed, "Don't you dare undermine me, Tom!" But it was too late. The crack in her facade was showing, and others were starting to see it. I slid my folder across the table and began laying out documents one by one, my deed, the exemption paperwork, and even copies of the HOAS original charter. Then I pulled out a final piece of paper, a formal letter drafted by the city attorney's office, warning the HOA that continued harassment of exempt property owners could result in civil penalties and personal liability for board members. The room went silent except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Karen stared at the letter as if it were a death sentence, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. This is intimidation," she stammered, pointing a shaky finger at me. "You're abusing your position as police chief to scare us into submission." I met her gaze evenly. "No, Karen, this is the law. Something you should have learned before you decided to weaponize your HOA position against people you don't like. I didn't come here to intimidate anyone. I came here to put an end to your harassment." The residents who had been sitting quietly in the back began murmuring, some nodding, others whispering things like, "He's right," and "I'm tired of all these fines." One woman even stood up and said aloud, "Karen, last month you fined me $200 because my son left his bike in the driveway for an afternoon. That wasn't harmony, that was cruelty." The cracks widened, and Karen realized she was losing her grip. She banged the gavel again, her voice shrill. "Order! Order! This meeting is adjourned. but the room didn't quiet. People kept talking, their frustrations spilling out, years of pent-up resentment suddenly released. Karen stormed out, slamming the door behind her, but by then the damage was done. I gathered my papers, thanked the residents for their time, and left the clubhouse with a quiet smile, knowing the tide had finally turned. But the story wasn't over yet. Because when cornered, people like Karen don't just surrender, they lash out harder, and sure enough, within days, she escalated the fight to a new level, filing an actual lawsuit in county court, not realizing that by doing so, she had moved the battle into my arena, where the rules were real. The law was clear, and her antics would finally be held accountable under the weight of actual justice. When Karen filed her lawsuit in county court, she thought she was climbing into the driver's seat, steering the narrative with her delusional sense of authority, but in reality she had just strapped herself into the back of a runaway train. Because the moment her complaint landed on the clerk's desk, it was processed like any other civil case and routed straight into the docket of Judge Ramirez, a seasoned no-nonsense judge who had little patience for frivolous litigation. I was served officially 2 weeks later, though I already knew it was coming, and I remember Jenna handing me the envelope with a smirk saying, "Your fan mail has arrived." Inside was Karen's masterpiece of paranoia, pages of ranting about nuisance behavior, public safety risks, and damage to community values, all written with the same melodramatic flair as one of her HOA newsletters. And yet, what made me laugh most was the remedy she sought. She was asking the court not only to fine me for violations, but to issue an injunction, banning me from hosting any future gatherings on my property without HOA approval. I handed the papers to Mark, the city attorney who had become personally invested in this little soap opera, and after scanning them, he chuckled, "This is going to be fun. She's basically asking the court to recognize the HOS authority over land they don't own. That's like me suing the governor because I don't like how he mows his lawn." We filed our response within days, attaching all the documentation Karen had ignored. My deed, the exemption certificates, the cities, jurisdictional maps, and even affidavits from neighbors testifying that my wedding hadn't disturbed them. But we didn't stop there. Mark also counterclaimed, seeking damages for harassment, legal fees, and defamation because Karen hadn't just filed a baseless complaint. She had plastered my name all over HOA newsletters, accusing me of being a menace to the community, which, as the police chief, directly attacked my reputation and professional standing. When the court date finally arrived, the courthouse lobby was buzzing like a hive, because word had spread far beyond our neighborhood apparently. Karen had boasted to anyone who would listen that she was taking down the police chief and restoring order to the community, so people showed up just to watch her crash and burn. Inside the courtroom, Karen strutted in with a file box stuffed full of papers and her so-called legal advisor, the same paralegal friend she had paraded at arbitration, while I sat at my table calmly with Mark, who looked like a man about to enjoy the best show of his career. When the judge entered and the case was called, Karen leapt into her opening like an actress taking the stage, dramatically describing my wedding as a raucous disturbance akin to a public festival, and accusing me of setting a dangerous precedent that would unravel the fabric of our community. Judge Ramirez listened for about 5 minutes before raising his hand to stop her. "Ms. Walker," he said firmly, "do you have any legal basis, any statute, ordinance, or contract that grants your HOA jurisdiction over the defendants?" "Property?" Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing as she stammered something about community expectations and implicit agreements. Ramirez cut her off. "That's not the law. This court recognizes deeds, contracts, and statutory authority, not vague expectations." Then he turned to Mark. "Counsel, do you have documentation?" Mark grinned, standing to present our thick packet. "Yes, Your Honor. Here is the deed to Chief Daniels's property. Here are the jurisdictional maps confirming it lies outside the HOA boundaries. And here is the exemption certificate filed with the county when the subdivision was created. Additionally, Your Honor, we have attached the HOS own charter, which explicitly states its authority does not extend to the parcel in question." The judge skimmed the top pages, his eyebrows rising, then looked back at Karen. Miss Walker, this seems fairly straightforward. Why did you believe you had jurisdiction here? Karen's face turned red as she blurted, because he lives in the neighborhood. Because his property is adjacent. Because without uniform enforcement, our community will collapse into chaos. The judge leaned back, unimpressed. So your argument is essentially that you wish you had authority, not that you actually do. Laughter rippled through the courtroom, and Karen spun around, glaring at the spectators as if she could silence them by sheer force of will. The judge banged his gavel lightly. Order, let's proceed. That's when Mark leaned into the counterclaim, detailing Karen's harassment, the bogus fines, the threats of foreclosure, and her reckless decision to involve emergency services. On the night of my wedding, wasting police resources for personal vendetta. He called neighbors to the stand, including Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who testified that Karen had fined her 3 times in 1 month for trivial violations, like leaving her curtains open after dusk. Another neighbor recounted how Karen had circulated newsletters publicly shaming families, which Judge Ramirez frowned at with visible distaste. When it was Karen's turn to cross-examine, she spiraled deeper, badgering witnesses with irrelevant questions, shouting over objections, and finally accusing me of orchestrating a conspiracy to destroy her authority. At one point, she turned to the judge and demanded he order me to resign as police chief for abusing power. Ramirez raised an eyebrow and said dryly, Miss Walker, this is a civil court, not a political rally. Stay on topic or I'll hold you in contempt. By the time closing arguments came, Karen was unraveling, her papers scattered across the table, her paralegal friend sitting pale and silent while Mark remained poised, delivering a succinct summary. Your Honor, this case is not about rules or harmony. It is about a person in a position of minor power who abused that power, targeted individuals, and attempted to extend her reach beyond the limits of the law. My client has endured harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. We ask that the court not only dismiss this frivolous suit with prejudice, but also grant relief to deter this kind of abuse from happening again. The judge didn't even take long to deliberate. He ruled decisively in our favor, dismissing Karen's complaint with prejudice, granting our counterclaim for legal fees and imposing a personal fine on her for filing a frivolous lawsuit. Furthermore, he said sternly, this court strongly cautions Ms. Walker against further harassment of neighbors or misuse of emergency services. Any future behavior of this nature may result in more serious legal consequences. The gavel struck, and the case was closed. Karen stood frozen, her face pale, her hands trembling as if the reality of her downfall had only just dawned on her. The crowd spilled out of the courtroom, buzzing with satisfaction, and I walked out with Jenna's hand in mine, Mark beside us chuckling. I haven't had this much fun in years. But the story didn't end at the courthouse door. Within weeks, the fallout spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Residents, emboldened by Karen's humiliation, organized a petition to remove her from the board, and within a month, she was voted out by a landslide. Without her iron grip, the HOA quickly reformed, slashing pointless fines, rewriting rules to be fair and reasonable, and even issuing apologies to families who had been wronged. As for Karen, she retreated into isolation, rarely seen outside her house. The once feared queen reduced to a cautionary tale whispered about at block parties. My wedding, meanwhile, became something of a local legend, retold with laughter at community gatherings. Not as a source of division, but as the turning point when the neighborhood finally stood up to tyranny. For me, it was more than a personal victory. It was proof that bullies, no matter how entrenched they seem, will always collapse when confronted with truth and accountability. Standing in my backyard months later, watching my family and neighbors laughing together under the same string lights that had hung during the wedding, I realized Karen's downfall had done something remarkable. It had restored peace, not just to my home, but to the entire community she once terrorized. And as I clinked a glass with Jenna, I whispered, to justice, and to never letting anyone like her run this place again. She smiled.